Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every Friday looking at the events of the past. Today on History Calling, we're travelling back to ancient Egypt to look at the history of the Library of Alexandria. Once home to much of the knowledge our ancestors had gathered, the library was arguably the Wikipedia of the ancient world. But when was it founded and by whom? How were its contents acquired? And when and how was it lost to the sands of time? Stay tuned to hear the evidence and decide for yourself. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and remember to subscribe to the channel and switch on notifications so you never miss an upload. I'll also leave a link to my Instagram in the description box where my username is History Calling. A degree of mystery surrounds the foundation of the Library of Alexandria, largely because the earliest sources which mention it are so unreliable. The oldest document we have which notes its existence is the 2nd century BC letter of Aristeas, also known as the letter to Philocrates. The author was supposedly a courtier of King, or Pharaoh, Ptolemy II Philadelphos of Egypt, but there is general agreement in the scholarship I've read that Aristeas was not a real person and that the document is very untrustworthy and littered with other information which can be proven, through comparisons to other sources, to be false. Another heavily used source is the work of Byzantium polymath John Tzetzes, who lived in the 12th century AD, so a millennium later. His collection of works, which obviously drew on much older writings, have also been found to be riddled with errors when compared with other sources. Nevertheless, these are the two best sources available for the early history of the library, and they have produced two competing stories as to how it came into being. The first tale you'll often hear is that the Library of Alexandria was created in around 300 BC, or perhaps a little later, at the behest of this man, King Ptolemy I Sotor. Ptolemy I had been one of Alexander the Great's main generals, and after a power struggle with other generals following Alexander's death in 323 BC, he gained control over Egypt, including Alexander's namesake city, Alexandria. Reigning from 305 to 282 BC, Ptolemy Sotor supposedly had the library created with the help of a man named Demetrius of Phaleron, who was a scholar and a former ruler of Athens, a city he'd been driven out of in 307 BC. The second version of the story gives credit to Ptolemy I's son, the aforementioned Ptolemy II Philadelphos, who reigned from 282 to 246 BC. Demetrius is still present, but this time helping the second Ptolemy, alongside other men named Lycophron of Chalcis, Zenidotus of Ephrasos, and Alexandros of Aetolia. As the historian Roger S. Bagnall has pointed out, however, it's unlikely that Demetrius and Ptolemy Philadelphos would have worked together on the library, as Demetrius had supported the claim of Philadelphos' half-brother to the throne, thereby earning the new king's enmity. In short, we don't know exactly when or by whom the library was created, but it seems clear that the Ptolemy royal family was heavily involved and that the library got up and running sometime during the 3rd century BC. Its exact location in Alexandria is unclear, however it's believed to have been situated within the white square you see here on this image from NASA, apparently near the modern-day Nabu Daniel Street and to the north of Horea Avenue. There were also in fact two libraries, according to John Tzetzes, one which he referred to as the outer library and another larger one inside the palace complex, meaning the royal palace of the Ptolemies. We don't know anything about their architecture, but it's a safe bet that they will have had plenty of shelves to hold scrolls. The library or libraries were also part of a larger learning complex, the other arm of which was the museo, from which the modern word museum derives. This literally meant the home of the muses and was a place where scholars could come together to live, learn and teach. We do have a description of this building from the writer Strabo, who wrote in roughly 30 to 25 BC and said that the museum is a part of the palaces. It has a public walk and a place furnished with seats, and a large hall in which the men of learning who belong to the museum take their common meal. Together, the library and the museum therefore formed something akin to a modern university. Egypt was the ideal place to create a library, for it was home to the papyrus plant, which was used to create papyrus to write on, as you see in this example, which shows the Book of the Dead of the priest Imhotep, whose name you might recognize from the movie The Mummy. When it comes to the number of books, or rather scrolls, like this one, in the library, again we have discrepancies in the sources. The writer calling himself Aristeas says that Demetrius told Ptolemy II that it housed more than 200,000, O king, and I shall make endeavour in the immediate future to gather together the remainder also, so that the total of 500,000 may be reached. Other sources give wildly different numbers, ranging from 40,000 to 700,000. Remember, though, that scrolls could hold multiple works on them, so their number doesn't match the number of texts collected. Roger Bagnall also sounds another word of caution here, urging us to consider how many books even existed in this period of time to be placed in the library. The printing press would not be invented until the mid-15th century after all. Every item in the library, and indeed the known world, had to be written out by hand by the relatively small number of literate individuals alive at the time, and while some authors certainly lived and died and have been forgotten entirely by history, Bagnall doubts that there were enough ancient writers whose work existed in the 4th and even the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC to fill up the number of scrolls being cited by some sources, not unless the library held dozens of copies of each work. Nor, he says, could such high numbers of scrolls have been indexed, for indexing systems which could have been used to organise such vast quantities of material had yet to be invented. Instead, the library had the Pinax, or tables, a 120-volume catalogue of all Greek writings written by the 3rd century AD librarian Callimachus of Cyrene, which, according to historian Lionel Casson, was likely based on a shelf list of the Library of Alexandria's contents. Nevertheless, even if it was smaller than some estimates, the library was certainly huge by the standards of the day, and it was an impressive accomplishment. It contained works on every subject matter known to man at the time, from literature to mathematics to cookbooks. But how was this accomplishment realised? How were its contents collected? To answer this, we again turn to ancient sources. The man you see here was called Galon of Pergamon, and he was a Greek writer living in the 2nd century AD, so about 500 years after the supposed foundation of the library. Here's what he had to say about how the library gained its contents. Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, meaning Ptolemy III, who ruled from 246 to 222 BC, was so eager to collect books that he ordered the books of everyone who sailed there to be brought to him. The books were then copied into new manuscripts. He gave the new copy to the owners whose books had been brought to him after they sailed there, but he put the original copy in the library with the inscription, "A book from the ships." They say that a copy of the 3rd book of the Epidemics, which was a book written in about 400 BC by the writer Hippocrates, has been found with the inscription, "A book from the ships, as amended by Menemon of Sidé." Some claim that the inscription does not say "as amended," but simply gives the name of Menemon, because when books were taken from all the others who sailed there, the servants of the king wrote down their names in the copies that were deposited in the storehouses. The servants did not place the books in the library immediately, but first they stored them away in piles in some other buildings. This little story suggests that knowledge was gathered up from all across the known world, but it's also interesting for what it tells us about how the books were supposedly organised before being placed in the main library. Incidentally, if you're wondering why older books were preferred over fresh copies, it's because they were believed to be more accurate, as the process of copying might introduce errors. Galen continues with another anecdote showing just how devious Ptolemy III could be in his pursuit of knowledge for his library. This Ptolemy is said to have given sufficient proof of his eagerness to collect old books by his behaviour towards the Athenians. After giving them 15 talents of silver as a surety, and a talent was a unit of weight and 15 talents was an astronomical sum, he received from them the manuscripts of Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus, and these were 3 of the most famous ancient Greek writers from the 6th and 5th centuries BC, on the understanding that he would simply make new copies from the manuscripts and then promptly return them intact. But after he had produced magnificent new copies on the finest writing material, he kept the books that the Athenians had sent to him and sent back to them the copies that he had made. He urged them to keep the 15 talents and at the same time to receive new copies instead of the old books that they had sent to him. The Athenians would have had no other option, even if he had kept the old books without sending new copies to them, because when they accepted the money, they had agreed that if he kept the books, then they would keep the money, and so they accepted the new copies and kept the money. As well as copying and even stealing the books of others, agents were also sent out to other cities far and wide, including Athens and Rhodes, to purchase books for the library. The result being that in its heyday, it, in combination with the museum, was a great centre of learning. It was freely available to those who were educated enough to use it, admittedly a small number of people, but this is antiquity we're talking about, and had a director or head librarian to oversee its functions. The first of these was apparently the Greek scholar Xenodotus, who worked on the poems of Homer, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey, and who instituted an alphabetical organisation system in the library before Callimachus and his Pnyx came along later. The library attracted other learned men too, including the Greek polymath Eratosthenes, who came to the city during the reign of Ptolemy III, and who is remembered for, among other things, the incredible feat of managing to calculate the Earth's circumference to within a few miles, which, by the by, just goes to show that there were people alive even thousands of years ago who knew that the Earth isn't flat. Eratosthenes would end up becoming the chief librarian of the Library of Alexandria from roughly 245 to 205 BC, followed by other eminent scholars including Aristophanes of Byzantium from 205 to 185 BC, who unfortunately ended up in prison for life after an attempt was made to poach him to be the librarian at the library belonging to the Attalid dynasty of Pergamum. Here you can see the position of Pergamum, which was in modern-day Turkey, relative to Alexandria. So, we've heard how and when the library may have been constructed, grown and used, but how was such an incredible achievement lost to history? There are several stories about the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. One theory holds that it was all Julius Caesar's fault. Supposedly when he came to the city in 48 BC, he ended up trapped in the palace complex by fighters loyal to his enemy Achilles. According to the writer Plutarch, Caesar encountered the peril of being shut off from water, since the canals were dammed up by the enemy. In the second place, when the enemy tried to cut off his fleet, he was forced to repel the danger by using fire, and this spread from the dockyards and destroyed the Great Library, which I've highlighted on this map. The historian Dio Cassius, writing of the same event, tells us that many places were set on fire, with the result that the docks and the storehouses of grain, among other buildings, were burned, and also the library, whose volumes, it is said, were of the greatest number and excellence. This seems pretty cut and dry, but modern historians have deduced that the destruction couldn't have been as complete as is insinuated here, and indeed another translation of Dio Cassius implies that only the books in the storehouses, which were waiting to be taken into the library, were actually burnt. In any event, it seems that the library, or perhaps the museum, was damaged in some way, but it couldn't have been destroyed completely, as it was still largely intact during the Roman occupation of Egypt. The amount of scholarship which we know was taking place in Alexandria in the decades afterwards strongly suggests that a good library was still present. And according to Plutarch, another famous Roman who visited Egypt, Mark Antony, supposedly gave 200,000 scrolls taken from other libraries at Pergamum, which was by then under his control, to his lover, Queen Cleopatra, items which can only have been intended for the great Egyptian library. Admittedly, even Plutarch says that this story could be fiction, but as Lionel Casson has pointed out, the tale wouldn't have been told by him if the Library of Alexandria was no longer in existence. Not only do we know the library survived Caesar, we also know that it survived him by many, many decades, at the very least. This is because during the reign of Emperor Domitian, which lasted from 81 to 96 AD, so 133 years after the fire set by Caesar, we hear from one of his biographers, Suetonius, that the emperor provided for having the libraries, meaning Roman libraries, which were destroyed by fire, renewed at very great expense, seeking everywhere for copies of the lost works, and sending scribes to Alexandria to transcribe and correct them. So we know Caesar didn't destroy the library, though he may have damaged it and/or the museum. What are the other theories regarding its fate? One is that it was mostly destroyed in around 273 AD when the Emperor Aurelian, whilst battling his enemies in the kingdom of Palmyra, brought the fighting to Alexandria, wreaking havoc on the palace complex in the process. Another is that it survived all the way up to 642 AD when the Arab conqueror Amir was supposedly ordered to burn all the books by the Caliph Omar. This story dates to long after the event it supposedly describes, however, and as with so many other theories regarding the library's destruction, it is difficult to take it too seriously. As there were actually two libraries and the museum, it's also possible that a combination of some or all of these events occurred, but with different parts of the complex being damaged or destroyed at different times. Another idea also holds that the library wasn't lost in one fell swoop or even in 2 or 3 cataclysmic events, but that it gradually deteriorated over the course of many decades, even centuries, as less money was directed towards its upkeep, which would have necessitated the laborious task of constantly recopying the older items, and the humid rather than desert climate in Alexandria, possibly combined with insect and rodent activity, gradually destroyed the papyrus. Whatever the cause, by about the middle of the first millennium AD, the library seems to have been no more. So what do you think of this story? Do you believe that the Library of Alexandria was as impressive as some ancient sources would have us believe, or that its size and the scope of its holdings has been exaggerated? And how do you think it was lost? Let me know in the comments section below. If you enjoy your history with a little dash of mystery, why not check out my Historical Mysteries playlist next, where you can hear about strange disappearances, dancing plagues, a whole room made of amber which was stolen by the Nazis, and much more. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.